He laughed at my help, dismissed my ideas, and thought I'd stay silent. But while he scrambled to save his $53 empire, I quietly orchestrated his downfall and claimed the power he never saw coming. They say success can blind you faster than love ever could. I used to think that was poetic nonsense until I met Ethan Cole. He wasn't born rich. Neither was I. We were both dreamers back then, two nobodies in New York, surviving on coffee, chaos, and ambition. He had that smile that could sell you a vision. And I had the discipline to make that vision real. Together, we were unstoppable. Or so I thought. The first office we ever rented was barely larger than a storage unit. We couldn't afford heat that winter. I remember typing financial forecasts with gloves on, my fingers numb but my heart on fire. Ethan would pace behind me, whispering big promises. "We'll have glass walls someday, Izzy. You'll run the floor." I believed him. We built everything side by side, heart and Cole strategies. My name first because he said it sounded elegant. Funny how that detail would later vanish. The first time I saw the new company website, my name was gone. Just Cole Enterprises. He said it was a branding decision. I smiled. But something in me cracked quietly, invisibly. That's how betrayal starts, not with knives or shouting, but with small edits in silence. Weeks passed. Success came like a storm. Investors, clients, magazine features. Ethan started wearing custom suits and speaking in percentages instead of promises. I still handled the numbers, the deals, the logistics, but now I was introduced as his assistant. Assistant. Not partner. Not co-founder. Not even friend. I remember one night at a gala hosted at the plaza. The air smelled like champagne and expensive perfume. The company had just hit its first $10 million valuation. I was proud. But when the host thanked Ethan Cole and his brilliant team, my name wasn't mentioned. Ethan just smiled at the applause and I clapped too. Because that's what loyal women do when they're too tired to fight in public. After that night, something changed. I stopped believing I was invisible. I realized I was being erased. But the real humiliation came later. It happened at the quarterly investor dinner. I had spent weeks preparing our presentation, data projections, growth models, acquisition forecasts. Every slide, every number, every contingency plan was mine. When the lights dimmed, Ethan stood before the room and presented my entire work as his own. Word for word. He even used my phrasing. I sat there, frozen, as they applauded him for my mind. When it was over, he leaned in and whispered, "Don't make that face, Izzy. You make me look ungrateful." That's when I knew I wasn't his partner anymore. I was his reflection, a mirror he used to make himself look bigger. That night, I went home to our penthouse overlooking Central Park, poured a glass of wine, and opened my old business journal. On the first page, I had once written, "We build together, we rise together." I crossed out "we" and wrote "I." It sounds dramatic, but it was the moment I came back to life. The next morning, he laughed when I suggested diversifying our assets, said I was thinking too small, said women didn't have the stomach for risk. Then he told me he was bringing in a real strategist. Her name was Camille. She had a finance degree from Yale and a smile that could light up a boardroom. 3 weeks later, she was sitting in my chair. No confrontation. No warning. Just a polite HR email: "Your role has been redefined." That's corporate language for you're being replaced by someone prettier, younger, and easier to control. I packed my desk in silence. Ethan didn't even look up when I walked out. The city felt colder that day. The snow had started to fall, the streets wet with slush. I stood outside the office building that I had once helped pay rent for, holding a cardboard box filled with 5 years of dreams. And I realized I wasn't angry. Not yet. Just empty. But emptiness is fertile ground. It's where ideas grow. In that silence, an idea began to form, small, sharp, and deliberate. I didn't want his apology. I wanted his empire. And I knew exactly where to start. Before I tell you what happened next, ask yourself something: have you ever helped someone rise, only for them to use your kindness as a ladder and kick you off once they reached the top? Because if you have, you already know what comes next. I rebuilt my life from the ashes of humiliation, but not everyone gets that second chance. Most people stay stuck in the silence, wondering what they could have done differently. Don't be one of them. Hit subscribe right now, because if you've ever been betrayed, you need to hear what I did next. And if you don't, tell me in the comments why you'd rather stay blind. Go ahead, I'll wait. The first night alone was the quietest sound I'd ever heard. My apartment was small, too small for memories as large as ours. The refrigerator hummed like a lonely machine. The city outside whispered through thin glass. I set my cardboard box down on the floor and just stared at it. Inside were the trophies of a life that no longer existed: company ID card, framed article from Forbes, a silver pen Ethan had once given me with the words, "To the woman who keeps me sharp." I ran my thumb over that engraving until it blurred. Then I dropped the pen in the trash. There's a moment after humiliation when your body feels weightless, not from peace, but from shock. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't even feel rage. Just a hollow quiet that asked, now what? I made tea instead of wine that night. Sat on the floor with spreadsheets scattered like fallen leaves. I opened my laptop, the one I'd bought myself before the company could claim ownership, and began combing through old financial files I'd backed up. Every empire has cracks. And Ethan's. I had built the blueprint myself. The plan didn't come in lightning flashes. It came in slow, deliberate pulses. Step 1. Find the weaknesses. Step 2. Find the silence. Step 3. Use both. I still had access to some of our old vendor contracts, the ones signed under my initials. Most people forget that signatures are data. Timestamps. Routing numbers. Even the smallest inconsistency can raise red flags in the right hands. I wasn't going to destroy him overnight. I was going to let him erode one decimal at a time. By midnight, my apartment floor looked like a war map. Sticky notes formed a timeline. Arrows connected names. A single circle in red ink read Camille equals entry point. Camille was perfect, ambitious, curious, eager to prove herself. She'd spend hours studying Ethan's systems, trying to impress him. Eventually, she'd notice the gaps I left visible enough to tempt her. I smiled for the first time that night, not because I was happy, but because I finally saw the outline of justice. He had built his castle on trust, and trust was the one currency I'd already withdrawn. At 3 a.m., I emailed an old contact, a quiet man named Miles Turner, forensic accountant turned whistleblower consultant. We'd met years earlier during a client audit. He'd once said, "If you ever need a ghost in the machine, call me." I wrote one line. "It's time." No explanation. Just that. Then I powered down the laptop, closed my eyes, and whispered into the dark. "You took my name off the door, Ethan. Now I'll take your name off the world." When I woke up, the city was still gray. Coffee steamed beside my laptop, the only warmth in a room that still smelled of cardboard and moss. I refreshed my inbox 3 times before it appeared. Miles Turner. Where do we start? 2 minutes later, I was typing faster than my thoughts could form. Cole Enterprises. Their internal audit structure is smoke and mirrors. I need eyes inside. Off record. Quietly. The well 41. He didn't ask why. He never did. Miles had built a career on silence. By noon, I received a file. No subject line, no signature. Just an attachment titled Entry, Protocol. Inside were encrypted scripts designed to slip through back-end compliance systems, a forensic worm disguised as an analytics update. In plain words, a ghost. All I had to do was place it where Ethan's new analyst Camille would find it, believing she'd discovered a shortcut to streamline reports. She'd run it herself, and the worm would crawl quietly through Cole Enterprises books, mapping every secret financial artery. But I couldn't move too fast. Revenge isn't a sprint. It's a season. I spent the next week creating noise, public noise. LinkedIn posts about new consulting opportunities. Photos of me at co-working spaces, tagging old colleagues. Let them think I was rebuilding, distracted. The more normal I appeared, the less he'd suspect. And suspicion was the enemy of patience. Then came the first sign that my silence was working. An email forwarded by a mutual acquaintance. "Ethan mentioned you in a meeting. He says you'll regret leaving." I almost laughed. He thought I'd walked away. He didn't realize I was already inside. That night, I walked past the Cole Enterprises tower. It rose above 7th Avenue like a monument to arrogance, glass, steel, and mirrored vanity. Through the windows I could see Camille at my old desk, still wearing that hopeful glow. She looked exactly like I once did, hungry, loyal, unaware she was standing on quicksand. For a second, I almost pitied her. Almost. At home, I uploaded the worm to a neutral cloud account and shared the link in a professional group Camille followed masked as a compliance automation tool. 2 hours later, the access log pinged. She'd clicked it. The ghost was inside. From that moment, every transaction, every expense report, every hidden asset Ethan had buried began to surface on my private dashboard. Shell companies, false transfers, even the offshore accounts he'd sworn didn't exist. He wasn't just arrogant. He was corrupt. And corruption leaves trails. I spent the next 3 nights tracing those trails, coffee after coffee, until my screen glowed with the full architecture of his empire. $53 million held together by lies and signatures. I had the keys to his kingdom. But I wasn't ready to turn the lock. Not yet. The first time I saw one of his investors panic, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like gravity. A quiet pull of inevitability. The data I'd gathered was a minefield of small, deliberate crimes: offshore tax shelters, falsified reporting, hidden payments to shell vendors that didn't exist. Nothing catastrophic alone, but together, they painted a pattern. A story. And stories, especially dirty ones, don't stay buried in New York for long. I didn't send the evidence anywhere, not yet. Instead, I leaked questions, anonymous whispers in investor chat boards, a concerned analyst flagging minor discrepancies, enough to make them look twice at their quarterly reports. Within days, I could feel the tension radiate through coal enterprises like an unseen fever. Meetings started running longer. Emails grew sharper. Camille stopped posting her cheerful morning photos. Ethan began checking his phone mid-conversation, jaw tightening more each time. He didn't know it yet, but his empire had developed a pulse, and I was the heartbeat behind it. But revenge doesn't taste like you imagine. It isn't fiery. It's cold and metallic, like blood from a bitten lip. Sometimes I'd look at my reflection on the laptop screen between lines of code and wonder, was I becoming the very thing I hated? Or had I always been this quietly ruthless, just waiting for someone to unleash it? I told myself it didn't matter. He had taken everything from me. I was only taking it back. Still, there were nights when I'd catch myself scrolling through old photos: Ethan and me in our first office, sitting on the floor eating cheap takeout, dreaming of something honest. And I'd feel that ache again. The one between who we were and what we'd become. But I couldn't afford nostalgia. Not now. 2 weeks in, Miles called. His voice was low, deliberate. You sure you want this to go public? Once the leak starts, you can't pull it back. I looked out the window. The skyline shimmered, indifferent. Not yet, I said. Let him squirm first. Let him feel it. I wanted Ethan to wake up every morning wondering which crack would break next. And it worked. One afternoon, while checking the mirrored feed from the company servers, I saw a string of frantic messages between Ethan and the board. Ethan, someone's leaking internal data. Board chair, clean it up. Fast. He was afraid. That was new. I closed my laptop, leaned back, and let the silence wash over me. The empire was trembling, but this was just a test, a warning shot. The real dismantling would come next. I'd spent years building him. I could take years undoing him. Patience was my luxury now. And somewhere between the spreadsheets and the sleepless nights, the fear that had once paralyzed me turned into clarity. I wasn't fighting for revenge anymore. I was reclaiming authorship. The next week unfolded in silence. Isabella didn't cry anymore. She had already done enough of that. Now her tears had turned into something colder, something steadier. Every morning, she woke at 6, made her coffee exactly how Thomas liked it, black, no sugar, and stared at the mug as if daring herself to drink his bitterness one more time. She never did. She'd pour it down the sink, watching the dark liquid spiral away like the life she once shared with him. At work, Thomas strutted through the halls of Ellington Group like he was born in a boardroom. People stood when he walked by. He wore power like a second skin. But under that crisp suit, his arrogance made him sloppy. And that was his weakness. Isabella had been the one to keep him organized: his schedule, his contacts, even his talking points for major deals. Without her, little cracks began to show. Missed meetings, misfiled documents, quiet rumors of tension with investors. She watched it all from the shadows. Her new role at Breyer & Co. put her in the same corporate orbit competitors who were tired of Ellington's dominance. Isabella kept her distance, careful not to show her hand too soon. She wasn't here for gossip or pity. She was here to learn. Every system, every network, Every legal backdoor that Thomas once ignored because he thought he was untouchable. One night, while reviewing a set of merger documents, she found something that made her pulse stop: Ellington's acquisition trail. It was cleaner than most, except for one small inconsistency buried under subsidiary records: an unregistered offshore account under an internal code name Havenpoint. She recognized the formatting. She had typed it once, years ago. She knew exactly what it was. Thomas's secret vault. She sat back, fingers trembling, heart hammering with a mix of anger and awe. He'd hidden millions, money meant for investors, money that had kept his empire afloat when it should have crumbled. If anyone ever exposed that, his fall would be catastrophic, not just legal but reputational. And in that moment, Isabella smiled for the first time in weeks. Because she realized something critical: she didn't need to scream to destroy him. She just needed to be quiet. Over the next month, she worked methodically, creating her own small team at Breyer & Co. Discreet analysts who thought they were gathering market intel. They didn't know the real purpose. Isabella used code names, alternate email routes, and burner phones. Every night, she pieced together the skeleton of Ellington's corruption one bone at a time. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was strategy. She started with the internal audits, then she moved to property records. From there, she linked Havenpoint to a shell company under Thomas's name in the Cayman Islands. The trail was messy, but she knew where to look because she had helped him build it. Irony had a cruel sense of humor. While the city glimmered outside her office window, Isabella spent her nights in the glow of computer screens and legal folders. Some evenings, she'd pause to stare at her reflection: tired eyes, sharper jawline, a quiet steel that hadn't been there before. The woman she saw wasn't the one who had once asked for permission to speak. She was someone else entirely, someone dangerous. Her friend Naomi noticed the change. "You've been different lately," she said one Friday night over dinner. Isabella smiled faintly. "Different can be good." Naomi tilted her head. "This isn't just about moving on, is it?" "No," Isabella said softly, setting down her glass. "It's about finishing what he started." Weeks later, Isabella received an anonymous envelope at her new office. No sender. Just her name written in bold black ink. Inside was a photograph: Thomas at a charity gala, smiling, his arm around the same woman he'd betrayed her with. On the back, a note: "He's expanding. He's using Havenpoint again." Her chest tightened. Someone else knew. She didn't know who sent it, but one thing was certain: the game had officially begun. And Isabella Ellington, once the obedient wife, now the quiet architect, had already drawn the blueprint for his downfall. By morning, she'd make her first real move. She opened her laptop, the reflection of her screen catching the faintest trace of a smile. "Let's begin," she whispered. Morning light spilled over the city like gold dust, coating the skyline in quiet promise. From her corner office at Breyer & Co., Isabella watched it rise, steady, inevitable, unstoppable. Just like her plan. It had been 3 months since she found the Havenpoint trail. In that time, she had become indispensable to her new firm. Her reports were sharper, her insights faster. Senior partners began copying her strategies for upcoming mergers. She no longer blended into the background. Now, people listened when she spoke. And that was precisely what she needed. Because the only way to dismantle Ellington Group was from within its own network. She started small, planting subtle narratives at investor luncheons, feeding numbers that painted Ellington as overleveraged, unstable. It was all true, technically, just curated truth. And curated truth was a powerful weapon. At a Friday investors' brunch, Isabella sat across from Harold Grant, an old associate of Thomas's who'd been quietly seeking a safer portfolio. Over smoked salmon and espresso, she dropped her first seed. "Ellington's recent overseas acquisition. Have you looked at the liquidity ratios?" she said lightly, stirring her coffee. "Numbers don't lie, but they do tend to whisper." Grant frowned. "Are you suggesting something's off?" "I'm suggesting," she replied with a small smile, "that a company run by ego tends to ignore arithmetic." He laughed, but it was uneasy. And unease, Isabella knew, spread faster than facts. That evening, her phone buzzed: an encrypted message from an internal contact she'd cultivated at Ellington. "Board called emergency audit Monday. Someone's rattled." She leaned back, exhaling slowly. One string pulled, and already the tremor had begun. Later that week, She attended a cross-firm networking event at the Lenox Tower Ballroom. The air shimmered with wealth, perfume, ambition, and subtle rivalry. Isabella moved through the crowd like she'd never left this world. Her black dress was deliberate, understated elegance, confidence without invitation. Across the room, she saw Thomas. He looked unchanged, charming, polished, oblivious. His laughter carried that same practiced arrogance that once disarmed her. But now, it didn't sting. It motivated. He didn't notice her yet. And she used that to study him the way a chess player studies the opposing king. His assistant whispered something in his ear. His jaw tightened. He excused himself abruptly and stepped aside to make a call. Isabella's lips curved. The audit had already reached him. Naomi appeared beside her with a flute of champagne. "You look like someone watching a storm," she scheduled. Isabella smirked. "Maybe I am." Naomi tilted her glass. "Just, don't drown in it." "I won't," Isabella said softly. "I learned how to swim a long time ago." That night, back in her apartment, she pinned fresh notes to her board dates, financial patterns, relationships inside Ellington. At the center was a printed photo of Thomas, half shadowed by the lamp's light. "Phase 2, she murmured, drawing a red line through Investor Stability Network. If Phase 1 was exposure through rumor, Phase 2 would be infiltration, taking over the contracts that kept Ellington breathing. And she already had her first target, the Vanderbilt Tech Partnership, the cornerstone of Ellington's latest expansion. If that deal faltered, the dominoes would fall. By Monday morning, she was in a glass-walled meeting room with Breyer & Co.'s senior partners, pitching a bold but legal restructuring proposal to Vanderbilt Tech. Every figure, every slide, crafted to make Ellington look like a sinking ship while Breyer appeared as the lifeboat. When she finished, the room was silent, impressed, calculating. The CEO finally said, "You're suggesting we terminate our current contract with Ellington?" "I'm suggesting you protect your future," Isabella replied. "While there's still time." They exchanged glances. One by one, heads began to nod. She didn't smile. She only tapped her pen once against the table, the quiet percussion of victory. That afternoon, Ellington Group received formal notice. Vanderbilt Tech was withdrawing from the merger. Estimated losses $43 million. By evening, Thomas was trending on Business News for strategic instability. Isabella watched the segment on mute, the flicker of the television reflecting in her eyes. A slow, deliberate breath. One contract down, one empire starting to sway. By Tuesday morning, Thomas was running through the hallways of Ellington Group like a man chasing a shadow he couldn't catch. Every phone call was sharp, every email clipped. Investors were calling in, demanding explanations. The media had sniffed the edges of the Vanderbilt withdrawal story, framing it as unexpected instability at Ellington Enterprises. I watched it all from my apartment, the faint hum of my laptop the only sound breaking the silence. The city outside moved on as always, indifferent, unaware that its most powerful empires were trembling from the quiet of my hands. I didn't celebrate. I catalogued. Every move he made, every decision fueled by panic, was logged in my private dashboard. Missed calls, frantic scheduling changes, boardroom shouting. A man who once controlled everything around him was now reacting, desperate, unaware that the puppet strings had been in my hands all along. And I hadn't pulled the first real string yet. That afternoon, I made my first call to Miles. "He's rattled," I said. "Good," Miles replied. "Now the trap must look like an opportunity." I smiled faintly. He didn't need to know I'd been thinking 3 moves ahead. Step 1. Destabilize his perception of loyalty. I planted subtle suggestions through intermediaries, a carefully worded memo, anonymous tips about a key investor reconsidering a partnership. Nothing concrete, just enough uncertainty to seed paranoia. Within hours, Thomas called Camille into his office. The tension leaked into every corridor. I imagined him pacing, gesturing, trying to assert authority he no longer commanded. And I imagined her eyes widening as he blamed her for mistakes she hadn't made yet. Watching that unfold in my mind was satisfying. Not because I enjoyed watching her struggle, but because I finally saw the weight of his empire pressing down on him instead of me. The next phase required finesse. I couldn't just expose everything at once that would draw suspicion too soon. Instead, I identified small pockets of vulnerability, contracts overdue, hidden liabilities, and subtle compliance gaps. I nudged Breyer and co-partners toward those openings in private briefings, ensuring that my influence would look like genius, not revenge. Every move was legally unassailable, every domino was placed just right. And Thomas had no idea I was the architect. By the end of the week, cracks began to widen. The board demanded emergency meetings. Camille, desperate to prove herself, started taking reckless shortcuts. Thomas, once confident and charming, now shouted into phones, scrawling red ink on reports he didn't fully understand. I took a moment to sit back and watch. The city lights shimmered outside my window, and I thought about the woman I used to be: obedient, trusting, silent when it hurt. She was gone. And in her place was someone who could dismantle an empire with nothing more than patience, precision, and proof. That night, Isabella drafted the next move, a quiet intervention that would target the very foundation of Thomas's network. A single contract with a minor investor small enough to go unnoticed if handled correctly, but enough to make the board second-guess him. I would make him question everything, trust no one, and discover too late that the questions were coming from the woman he humiliated. Phase 2 was complete. The empire had begun to shake. And when he realized why, it would be too late. By the middle of the second week, Thomas was visibly unraveling. It wasn't just the Vanderbilt deal. Smaller cracks had begun to echo throughout Ellington Group. Minor partners were asking questions, auditors were probing deeper, and a whisper network was forming among the employees. All because I had fed one small, carefully crafted uncertainty into the system. I sat in my apartment, watching the notifications appear on my encrypted dashboard. Every message was a pulse in the system, each ping a confirmation that my influence was spreading. I wasn't touching his empire directly, at least. Not yet, but he was reacting as if I were. That was the elegance of my strategy. The ghost of a hand guiding his own downfall. It was fascinating to observe. Fear changes people. Desperation makes them sloppy. Overconfidence blinds them. And Thomas, for all his arrogance, had not anticipated that the woman he dismissed, the one he humiliated, would outmaneuver him quietly, invisibly. I needed allies. But real allies, not casual partners who could be bribed or intimidated. I needed people who understood leverage, who could execute subtle manipulations without ever knowing the full picture. I reached out to Naomi, not revealing the full scope. "I need you to help me guide investor sentiment," I said. Just enough to raise eyebrows, nothing more. Naomi understood. She had seen my transformation, the quiet steel beneath my exterior, and she didn't ask questions. That night, we worked together, mapping investor relationships, plotting points of influence, and identifying which vulnerabilities could be exploited legally but effectively. Every small nudge, every whisper, every carefully planted suggestion built pressure inside Ellington Group. Thomas responded predictably. He micromanaged, overcorrected, and alienated his trusted staff. And that was just the beginning. The following Monday, I orchestrated the first real domino to fall. I convinced a key investor to hold off on approving a minor acquisition for Ellington, providing technical analysis that appeared objective and neutral. Minutes after the board received the notice, Thomas was summoned to an emergency meeting. His face, always composed, cracked for the first time in months. Employees noticed. Rumors spread. The media, hungry for drama, began circling with questions about Ellington instability. And I hadn't even touched the core assets yet. That night, I reviewed the logs. The investor had acted exactly as I predicted, raising just enough doubt to cause internal chaos without triggering suspicion of deliberate sabotage. My plan was working: calculated chaos, perfectly executed. I allowed myself a quiet moment. Sitting alone, city lights flickering against my window, I thought about the power of patience. Revenge, I realized, wasn't in the immediate strike, it was in the slow, inevitable collapse. The anticipation, the meticulous orchestration, the knowledge that every tremor I caused was built on precision. Thomas would soon realize the storm wasn't coming from the outside. It had been inside all along. I closed my laptop with a quiet click and whispered, "Tomorrow the first true fracture will appear." Tuesday morning brought a storm I had been quietly engineering for weeks. Thomas walked into the boardroom, his suit crisp, hair perfect, but his composure fractured. Emails flagged urgent approvals, calls from minor investors demanding explanations, whispers of doubt spreading like wildfire. I watched the live ticker from my apartment, every blinking red number a pulse of confirmation. My plan was working. The first real fracture came when I orchestrated a subtle leak through Naomi to a key stakeholder and institutional investor who had been loyal to Ellington for years. Nothing overt. Just a carefully worded email questioning projected returns on a small but high-profile acquisition. By mid-morning, the board convened an emergency session. Thomas paced, tried to assert authority, but every question thrown at him was met with uncertainty. The investor had already started pulling back, citing concerns about financial transparency. He didn't know it was me. And that made it sting all the more. I had to stay invisible. Phase 2 of my plan required precision. I monitored every internal chat, every message, every reaction. Camille, once eager to impress Thomas, now hesitated, second-guessing her decisions. Employees who had once avoided me now whispered in hallways, unaware that their confusion was orchestrated. And then, the pièce de résistance. I sent an anonymous report to the press highlighting minor but true discrepancies in Ellington's accounting practices. Carefully framed, legally sound, and sourced to concerned analysts, within hours, financial news outlets began circulating the story. The dominoes began to fall. By evening, Thomas's office was chaos. He shouted into phones, trying to stem the tide of investor panic, while employees took defensive stances, eyes darting, whispering. The man who had once humiliated me, controlled me, made me doubt myself, was now struggling to hold on to the empire I had helped build. I poured a glass of water and leaned against my kitchen counter, watching the live news ticker. His name was everywhere. Ellington Group under scrutiny, potential instability, investors uneasy. I allowed myself a small smile, not from cruelty but from justice. The woman who had been silenced, humiliated, dismissed, was now the invisible hand dismantling the very world he had tried to dominate. The first strike was complete. Phase 1 of my corporate comeback had succeeded. And Thomas, arrogant and unprepared, was only beginning to feel the weight of what he had ignored, underestimated, and betrayed. Tomorrow, the cracks would widen. And by next week he wouldn't recognize the empire he thought was unshakable. The morning felt deceptively quiet. The city outside my window moved with its usual rhythm, honking horns, distant sirens, the hum of life that went on as if the world hadn't changed. But I knew differently. Ellington Group was beginning to crack, and Thomas was walking blindfolded along a cliff's edge. I poured coffee slowly, savoring the warmth. My apartment smelled faintly of vanilla and faint leather from my desk chair. I watched the steam rise, thinking about how patience had become my weapon. Revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't immediate. It was deliberate. Weeks of meticulous planning had led to this moment. Investor doubts had grown into serious questions. Media whispers had turned into headlines. And Thomas? He was still confident, still trying to command control, unaware that every move he made was anticipated, every reaction catalogued, every panic subtly guided. He didn't know who was pulling the strings. The first real domino fell at the Monday board meeting. I had positioned an anonymous tip about Havenpoint, the hidden offshore account, through an intermediary, careful to make it appear as an internal compliance observation. The board called an immediate audit. The room where Thomas sat, usually brimming with his authority, was now thick with tension. I could picture him pacing, face tight, hands shaking slightly as he tried to maintain composure. Every question from the auditors chipped at the foundation he had built over decades. And I, unseen, was watching the first cracks appear in real time. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to remember what it felt like to be powerless, humiliated, and trapped by his dominance. And I realized how far I had come. The fear, the tears, the nights of silent anger, all of it had built something stronger than rage, precision. I wasn't just taking revenge. I was reclaiming everything he had tried to steal from me, my dignity, my influence, my life. By Wednesday, small investors had begun questioning additional contracts. Minor suppliers hesitated, wondering if payments would come on time. Ellington's internal communications were a mess. Staff were defensive, wary, and suspicious of one another. Thomas, desperate, made mistakes, urgent memos that contradicted earlier instructions, rushed approvals that led to inconsistencies in financial reporting. Every misstep fueled my quiet satisfaction. I tracked each one, noting patterns, preparing to leverage them further. The more he panicked, the more predictable he became. And then came the first real public sign of instability, a press release questioning Ellington's liquidity. carefully phrased by someone I'd influenced. A journalist who had been tipped anonymously. The story went live online. Headlines hinted at internal uncertainty, while suggesting that smart investors might need to reconsider exposure to Ellington Group. I leaned back, letting the gravity of the moment settle. One domino had fallen, and I could see the trajectory of the rest. The beauty of this strategy was invisibility. He would never see me coming. He would never know who had orchestrated the first real strike. He would only feel the empire he thought was untouchable slipping from his hands. I pulled a fresh sheet of paper from my desk, drawing arrows between board members, investors, and subsidiaries. Each line represented a thread I could tug. Each thread represented leverage, and by the end of the week those threads would tighten, forcing him to react, to show his weakness publicly. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Thomas had underestimated me. He had laughed at my help, belittled my contributions, assumed my departure was a victory. But he was wrong. And soon, very soon, he would realize just how wrong he had been. By Thursday morning, the air inside Ellington Group's offices had shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was the subtle tension in the way employees avoided eye contact, the way memos grew more urgent, the hurried footsteps echoing in corridors. Thomas could feel it, even if he didn't know its source. I watched it unfold from my apartment, the skyline reflecting off the glass like shards of broken glass. Every subtle misstep, every whisper of uncertainty, every hesitant glance at the board, I catalogued them. I didn't need to be there. They were doing my work for me. It was ironic, really. The man who had once humiliated me, who had dismissed my insights, who had treated my presence as optional, now faltered under the weight of his own empire, guided by a ghost he couldn't see. The first key move of the day involved Eleanor Fisk, a minor investor Thomas relied on heavily for his tech acquisitions. I had nurtured a discreet line of communication with her through Naomi. Nothing incriminating, just factual analysis highlighting subtle weaknesses in Ellington's latest acquisition proposal. Enough to plant doubt. By mid-morning, Eleanor had sent a terse email to Thomas's office, requesting clarifications and additional audits before committing to funding. The board convened urgently. Thomas tried to assert control, but the questions kept coming, like a relentless tide. Each one forced him to explain, justify, and stumble. His usual confidence was cracking, replaced by tight jaws and a restless energy I had seen in him before, only directed at me then. And in that energy I saw something new: fear. A subtle, insidious fear that crept under his skin, settling in his chest, clouding his thoughts. By evening, I had orchestrated another quiet nudge, an anonymous tip to another minor investor, framed as internal concern over Ellington's liquidity projections. Within hours, the investor called a private meeting with the board. Thomas, already flustered, was forced to attend, answer, explain, justify every number he once recited confidently. I could almost hear the empire's heartbeat faltering. At my apartment, I sipped tea and updated my tracking sheet. I marked every investor concern, every hesitant step from Thomas, every minor miscalculation. These weren't mistakes born of incompetence, they were the predictable reactions I had been waiting for. He had underestimated me. He had laughed at my help. He had assumed leaving me behind was victory. And now every thread of his empire that had been built on arrogance was fraying slowly, invisibly, inevitably. I allowed myself a fleeting thought. How poetic it was that a single whisper, a single carefully placed suggestion, could undo decades of hubris. No shouting, no public confrontation. Just leverage, patience, and precision. And Thomas? He was still blind. Still chasing the chaos without realizing who had set it in motion. By Friday, Ellington Group was teetering on the edge of visible chaos. The subtle shifts I had orchestrated were snowballing. Minor investors were calling emergency meetings. Staff who once moved confidently through the corridors now hesitated, unsure whose instructions to follow. And Thomas? He was unraveling in ways I had predicted with meticulous precision. I watched from my apartment, the city lights reflecting in the glass like shards of a fractured empire. Every frantic email, every terse phone call, every trembling hand on a report felt like a small victory, but I didn't allow myself to celebrate. Precision required patience. Timing was everything. He still didn't know the architect of this chaos. He assumed mistakes were internal incompetence, missed deadlines, or minor investor jitters. He assumed nothing. He assumed wrong. I planted the next nudge through carefully chosen intermediaries inside Ellington. Minor errors that I had seeded earlier were now referenced in memos, highlighted in reports, and whispered in corridors. Employees who had once trusted each other now questioned decisions. Camaraderie turned to suspicion. Board members who had supported Thomas now debated every recommendation he made. The beauty of it was subtlety. I didn't have to confront him directly. I didn't need evidence. Just enough suggestion, enough doubt, and the natural cracks in his arrogance did the rest. And yet watching him struggle wasn't just satisfying, it was bittersweet. The man I had once loved, once trusted, once believed in, had become a cautionary tale in my hands. By midday, I moved the next piece, a carefully timed leak about a secondary acquisition Thomas was pursuing. I framed it as a compliance inquiry from a minor but influential board member. Within hours, internal meetings turned into debates, memos were circulated in haste, and Thomas's instructions were questioned openly. He tried to maintain composure, but the strain was showing. A board member raised concerns during an all-hands meeting, and I imagined the flush of frustration rising across his face. His empire, once impenetrable, was now under scrutiny from every direction. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. Not out of cruelty, but because justice had taken on a quiet, methodical form. That evening, I drafted the final maneuver for the week. A small, legally sound, anonymous report highlighting overlooked liabilities in Ellington's portfolio enough to trigger a regulatory review if investigated further. I knew the board's next steps would amplify pressure on Thomas. I had planted the seeds. I just had to wait for them to sprout. And sprout they would. Thomas had no idea the first domino was just the beginning. He had no idea who had set it in motion. By Monday morning, Ellington Group was teetering on the edge. Investor confidence had eroded quietly but effectively over the previous week, and internal distrust had metastasized into full-blown tension. Thomas walked into the boardroom, his usual aura of authority fractured, his sharp words now tinged with frustration. I could almost see him measuring the room, trying to regain control, unaware that the strings had been in my hands all along. I sat in my apartment, quietly reviewing the latest updates from my network. Emails flagged urgent board inquiries, minor investors threatened withdrawal, and employees whispered speculation in corridors. Each ripple confirmed the effectiveness of my strategy. This was the moment, the first real public fracture. I had orchestrated it meticulously. A legally sound, anonymously filed report highlighted minor discrepancies in Ellington's latest acquisition projections, small enough to evade regulatory alarm, yet significant enough to rattle investors. Within hours, the news outlets began circulating the story. Headlines hinted at internal uncertainty. Ellington acquisition raises questions. Investors seek clarification on corporate decisions. Potential instability at Ellington Group. Thomas's phone never stopped ringing. He paced in front of the board, attempting to assert authority, but each question exposed him further. Subtle miscalculations he had overlooked now appeared glaring. Panic crept into his voice. I allowed myself a quiet, controlled smile. The man who had humiliated me, dismissed me, assumed my departure was inconsequential, he was now forced to face a reality I had anticipated months ago. By afternoon, I moved the second wave. Another anonymous tip, this time to a prominent shareholder, suggested a review of liquidity and contract dependencies. The board convened a sudden meeting. Thomas, exhausted, tried to explain, to justify, to assert the empire's stability, but every member questioned, debated, and second-guessed him. And I watched, quietly, invisibly. He had no idea. Every domino, every tremor, every ripple of chaos, orchestrated without a single overt action on my part. By evening, the full weight of the week's strategic strikes landed. Investor withdrawals were imminent. Media speculation was mounting. Internal morale was fractured. And Thomas, once untouchable, was scrambling, isolated, and vulnerable. I leaned back, the city lights flickering across the glass, and allowed myself a rare thought. The woman who had once been silenced, humiliated, dismissed, was now the invisible force dismantling the empire of the man who had underestimated her. Phase 1 of my corporate comeback was complete. The first domino had fallen, and Thomas would only realize its cause too late. The weekend after the first domino fell felt unusually still. The city hummed, indifferent to the quiet war I was orchestrating. I spent the hours mapping every board member, investor, and executive, identifying leverage points I could exploit. Each name, each relationship, each subtle insecurity became a thread I could tug without ever revealing my presence. Thomas, oblivious to my planning, spent the weekend reviewing damage control strategies. He assumed the initial setback was a temporary stumble, a minor misstep. He didn't know that this was just the beginning. Phase 2 of my silent strike would shake him to the core. And he still wouldn't see me coming. Monday morning, I began quietly reaching out to key allies within Breyer & Co. Naomi coordinated communications with investors, framing requests for clarifications and audits as prudent, necessary, and objective. Everything appeared neutral, but every action created pressure points inside Ellington Group. I had learned that corporate collapse was rarely caused by a single strike. It was the accumulation of small, persistent uncertainties, the whispers, the minor doubts, the ever-present sense that someone was watching. And I had orchestrated each element. The beauty of patience was that I didn't need confrontation. I didn't need drama. Every small action built on the last, a chain reaction of inevitability. By mid-morning, Thomas was already reacting. Emails flagged urgent requests for explanations. He called board members, tried to reassure investors, even attempted to demonstrate control over internal staff, but the cracks were widening too quickly. I watched him pace in my imagination, hands on his desk, jaw tight, lips pressed together. The man who had once controlled everything, who had belittled me when I tried to help him, was now unraveling in real time. And I hadn't even executed the first major strike yet. I allowed myself a quiet smile. Patience, precision, invisibility, that was my arsenal. Phase 2 required careful timing. I orchestrated a series of minor yet impactful miscommunications within Ellington Group. Contracts were misfiled, approvals overlooked, and internal memos phrased to create hesitation without exposing the source. Staff who had once trusted Thomas now questioned his decisions, and minor investors grew uneasy. By the end of Monday, Thomas's confidence had been chipped further. The media began reporting on Ellington's internal turbulence, and I made sure to subtly amplify these whispers through anonymous tips and social media monitoring. Every ripple I created widened the wave of uncertainty. He didn't know it yet, but the walls were closing in. That night, I reviewed the week's progress. Each investor influenced, each internal fracture noted, each whisper tracked, everything aligned perfectly. Thomas's panic had escalated exactly as I had predicted. The empire he once controlled effortlessly was now slipping through his fingers, and my hands remained clean, unseen, untouchable. Phase 2 had begun. And by next week, he would feel the full weight of my silent strike. By Tuesday morning, the boardroom at Ellington Group was quietly buzzing with tension. Thomas tried to assert authority, but subtle doubts had already taken root among directors and senior staff. I had planted just enough uncertainty that their eyes were no longer on him with confidence. They were assessing, questioning, hesitating. I watched it all unfold from my apartment. City streets below continued their indifferent rhythm, but inside the empire Thomas had built, chaos was growing like an invisible wildfire. Every misstep he made, every miscommunication, every hesitant glance from a board member played perfectly into my design. And he didn't know I was the hand guiding it. I reached out to Naomi again. Focus on board sentiment, I instructed. Frame any questions as standard diligence, nothing confrontational. Just persistent, subtle nudges. By mid-morning, Thomas was fielding requests for additional reports, clarifications, and internal audits, all seemingly routine, all perfectly legal, all strategically timed to force him into mistakes. Minor errors he had overlooked became magnified. Decisions that normally would have been routine now generated discussion and debate. I could see it. The man who had laughed at my suggestions, dismissed my input, and belittled my presence was now floundering, cornered by the very structures he once controlled. By Wednesday, the pressure escalated further. I anonymously highlighted a contractual dependency to an investor who held sway over a key acquisition. Suddenly, the investor requested an immediate review. The board, uneasy and eager to avoid risk, convened a meeting. Thomas entered face tight with forced composure, only to be bombarded with questions he had no prepared answers for. He tried to assert authority. He tried to reassure them. But every word, every gesture, only reinforced their doubt. The man who had once seemed untouchable now moved through the room like a trapped animal, tense, cornered, and desperate. I allowed myself a quiet thought. Revenge doesn't have to be loud, it doesn't have to be dramatic. It is the accumulation of doubt, the careful orchestration of inevitability, and it tastes far sweeter than any momentary triumph could. By Thursday, internal miscommunications had been subtly intensified. Contracts were phrased ambiguously, approvals delayed just enough, and memos carefully worded to sow hesitation. Directors second-guessed each other, employees questioned instructions, and Thomas, desperate to regain control, made increasingly rash decisions. I tracked each error meticulously, noting patterns and predicting reactions. Every small mistake compounded the perception of instability. Investors began asking for additional reassurances. Media whispers hinted at growing unease. The dominoes were falling faster now. And Thomas still didn't see the strings. By Friday evening, the first critical public consequence emerged. A key investor, spurred by anonymous but credible information I had seeded, pulled back from a minor but high-profile acquisition. The news leaked quietly to the press. Headlines hinted at internal turbulence. Ellington acquisition in question. Investor confidence shaken. Potential instability at Ellington Group. Thomas received the notice like a blow to the chest. Calls, emails, and rushed meetings followed. His panic was palpable. His empire, meticulously constructed over decades, was now being questioned on multiple fronts. And I remained unseen, untouchable, the architect of every tremor. The silent strike was working. Phase 2 had fully ignited. Thomas's control was slipping, and the first real cracks in his empire were now visible to the world. By Monday of the following week, Thomas's world was quietly unraveling. The initial investor concerns had rippled through the board. Staff whispered hesitantly in corridors. Subtle questions during meetings now felt like sharp probes aimed at him personally. I watched it all unfold from my apartment, city lights casting fractured patterns across my desk, mirroring the state of his empire. It was remarkable to observe. The man who had once dominated every room, silenced dissent, and dismissed my input was now reacting like a man unsure of where the next blow would come. He was tense, defensive, and, above all, predictable, and I had catalogued every reaction. Phase 3 required precision. I carefully leaked a minor inconsistency in Ellington's projected earnings to a small, influential board member, disguised as a routine internal query. Within hours, discussion turned into debate. Every other director, previously supportive, now demanded clarifications, questioning Thomas's leadership. He tried to regain control, his voice sharp, instructions hurried, but every word he uttered only deepened the tension. The cracks I had planted were widening, fed by doubt and fear. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about confrontation. It was about invisibility, about letting the empire collapse from within while the architect remained unseen. By mid-afternoon, I executed the next layer. Anonymous tips, framed as routine compliance concerns, reached several influential investors. Minor yet credible, these messages suggested that Ellington's internal communications were inconsistent and that recent acquisitions lacked clarity in documentation. Within hours, board meetings escalated. Thomas, now visibly frustrated, attempted to assert authority, but the board questioned every recommendation. Staff hesitated before following instructions. Investor confidence wavered further. Every ripple compounded into visible tremors, and all of it was invisible to him. He had no idea who had set these dominoes in motion. By evening, Thomas faced his first public fracture. A key investor withdrew support from a planned acquisition, citing lack of confidence in leadership clarity. The news quietly hit the financial press. Headlines hinted at instability without directly naming him, but the implications were clear. Inside Ellington Group, panic spread. Staff scrambled, meetings multiplied, and Thomas attempted to patch cracks that only deepened under pressure. And still, I remained unseen, untouchable, orchestrating every move with precision. The empire he had built on arrogance and dismissal was crumbling. And I, the one he had laughed at, the one he had belittled, was the architect of its slow, inevitable collapse. By Thursday, the storm I had been orchestrating reached a crescendo. The first investor withdrawals had triggered secondary concerns, which rippled into board discussions that Thomas could no longer control. I sat in my apartment, reviewing the latest updates with quiet satisfaction. Every misstep, every hesitation, every panic-stricken call confirmed that my plan was working. He was still unaware of the hand guiding his collapse. He assumed mistakes were internal incompetence, market fluctuations, or simple bad luck. He had no idea it was me, the very person he had dismissed, humiliated, and underestimated, moving the pieces invisibly, carefully, inevitably. And soon, he would realize too late. I executed the final wave of Phase 2. Another anonymous tip, this time to the largest shareholder, highlighted minor but credible concerns over liquidity and contract dependencies. The board convened immediately. Thomas, exhausted and fraying at the edges, faced relentless questioning. Every instruction he gave was challenged. Every decision scrutinized. I imagined him pacing in the boardroom, jaw tight, hands trembling slightly as he tried to project authority. But his authority was gone. His empire, once untouchable, was now slipping through his fingers, and I had not lifted a finger in public. Not once. By evening, media reports quietly hinted at instability. Investors began retracting commitments. Staff whispered about the lack of clear direction. Thomas tried to reassure everyone, but each statement only amplified doubts. The empire he had built with arrogance and hubris was unraveling in real time. I allowed myself a rare, quiet smile. The man who had belittled me, laughed at my ideas, dismissed my contributions, was now forced to confront a reality he had never anticipated. By the weekend, Phase 2 concluded with full effect. Investor confidence plummeted publicly. The board questioned Thomas's leadership openly. Staff hesitated before acting. Every domino I had set in motion now aligned perfectly. Thomas, panicked and disoriented, scrambled to salvage what remained, but it was too late. I had won. Quietly, invisibly, with precision, with patience. The empire he had relied on to define his power was now mine to influence, and he could do nothing to stop it. Monday morning arrived with an almost deceptive stillness. The city moved in its usual rhythm, indifferent to the storm brewing inside Ellington Group. Thomas, frayed and desperate, had begun to grasp the magnitude of the instability, yet he remained blind to its origin. Every misstep he made, every panicked decision, only tightened the trap I had so carefully constructed. Weeks of careful planning, subtle influence, and invisible manipulation had led to this moment. I had guided every ripple, anticipated every reaction, and orchestrated every domino that had fallen. Now it was time for the reckoning, the moment where the invisible hand became undeniable, even if my identity remained a secret. And he would finally face the consequences of underestimating me. By mid-morning, I triggered the first visible strike. A series of carefully timed disclosures, financial discrepancies, minor contractual oversights, and board concerns surfaced simultaneously. The information was accurate, legally sound, but presented in a way that magnified urgency. Investors and board members demanded immediate meetings. Staff began questioning priorities, hesitating to act without explicit instructions. Thomas tried to assert control, pacing in the boardroom, issuing instructions with his characteristic force. But the cracks I had nurtured over weeks had now become chasms. Every move he made drew scrutiny. Every explanation he offered generated more questions. I allowed myself a quiet, cold smile. The man who had laughed at me, dismissed me, humiliated me, was now scrambling under the weight of his own empire. By afternoon, I executed the next layer. Anonymous reports highlighting internal mismanagement reached multiple investors and minor media outlets. Headlines began hinting at instability. Ellington leadership questioned, investor confidence wavers, board concerns escalate. The board convened an emergency session. Thomas's attempts to reassure them were met with pointed questions and visible skepticism. Staff murmured quietly, tense and cautious. And all the while, I remained invisible, untouchable, orchestrating the perfect crescendo. He had no idea who had engineered this. Yet he could feel the empire slipping through his fingers. And in that realization, I found a quiet satisfaction, not cruelty, but justice executed with precision. By evening, the first critical public consequences became unavoidable. One of Ellington's largest investors pulled funding, citing lack of confidence in leadership clarity. The news quietly circulated, amplified by minor media coverage. Thomas received the notice like a punch to the chest. Calls, emails, and rushed meetings followed in rapid succession. His empire, built on arrogance and power, was crumbling publicly. And I had orchestrated every move. Phase 1 of the reckoning was complete. The first wave of visible collapse had begun. And in the days to come, Thomas would confront the full extent of the empire's fracture. Tuesday morning arrived with a subtle sense of anticipation. Thomas had begun realizing that the cracks were no longer internal whispers but visible fractures. Investor confidence wavered. Board members whispered in corners, staff hesitated to act without explicit guidance. And I watched it all unfold from my apartment, quiet, precise, and invisible. Weeks of invisible maneuvers had built to this moment. The first wave had shaken him, but now the second phase too of the reckoning would force him to confront his failures under the scrutiny of everyone he once controlled. He had laughed at me, dismissed my ideas, and belittled my presence. Now, every misstep he made would be amplified. By mid-morning, I leveraged subtle miscommunications within Ellington Group. Internal memos were phrased ambiguously, approvals delayed just enough, and previously overlooked discrepancies were quietly highlighted to key board members. The resulting uncertainty forced them to question Thomas openly. He tried to regain composure, pacing the boardroom, issuing instructions, asserting authority, but the cracks were now visible. Directors hesitated, employees paused, and investors requested urgent meetings. Every action Thomas took only compounded doubt and scrutiny. I could almost see him in my mind, tense shoulders, tight jaw, fingers tapping on the desk, trying desperately to project control over an empire slowly unraveling under his very hands. By mid-afternoon, I triggered the second wave of public pressure. Anonymous yet credible reports were strategically released to investors and minor media outlets, hinting at internal instability and leadership mismanagement. The ripple effect was immediate. Board members demanded clarity, investors requested urgent reassurances. Staff grew restless, and whispers became questions voiced aloud. Thomas, exhausted and flustered, tried to regain authority. Each attempt only highlighted the growing disarray. His empire, once untouchable, was visibly crumbling. I allowed myself a quiet, controlled smile. Not out of cruelty but because justice, executed with precision, is always more satisfying than confrontation. By evening, the full magnitude of Phase 2 became undeniable. Investor withdrawals were underway, and the board openly debated Thomas's capacity to lead. Minor media coverage amplified the perception of instability. Thomas's attempts to reassure them failed. Panic crept into his voice. Decisions were questioned, priorities challenged, authority undermined. He had underestimated me. He had assumed my silence meant submission. And now he faced the consequences of that mistake. By Wednesday morning, the tremors I had carefully engineered began to transform into visible earthquakes. Investor confidence, already shaken by subtle internal fractures and anonymous tips, now wavered publicly. The board's patience thinned. Staff hesitated in corridors, unsure whose directives to follow. And Thomas walked into the boardroom weighed down, not by fatigue alone, but by the creeping awareness that his empire was slipping from his grasp. He had tried to maintain control, but the cracks I had nurtured over weeks had widened into chasms. Every hesitant glance from a director, every cautious question from staff, every whisper among investors tightened the pressure around him like an invisible noose. And I had engineered it, every single move, every domino. By late morning, I executed the next strategic wave. A minor, legally credible financial discrepancy was leaked just enough to raise questions in investor circles. The media, sensing vulnerability, published understated reports hinting at instability. Ellington leadership under scrutiny. Investor confidence wanes. Board questions executive decisions. Inside the boardroom, Thomas faced relentless questioning. His explanations, precise in content but faltering in tone, did little to reassure. Directors debated openly, staff hesitated before acting, and investor representatives requested immediate clarifications and additional audits. I allowed myself a quiet, cold smile. The man who had dismissed me, humiliated me, underestimated me was now struggling publicly under a storm I had orchestrated invisibly. By afternoon, Thomas began making visible mistakes. Decisions he normally executed with effortless authority were questioned and delayed. Staff hesitated to follow instructions. Investors pressed for immediate answers. Board members openly debated leadership strategy. Panic crept into his demeanor, and the cracks in his facade were now evident to everyone in the room. I watched it unfold like a carefully choreographed play. The arrogance, the missteps, the desperation, all orchestrated with invisible precision. My revenge was no longer subtle, it was undeniable, though my hand remained unseen. By evening, the first tangible consequences became unavoidable. A major investor withdrew support from a high-profile acquisition. The news spread quickly through financial channels. Thomas received the notification like a strike to the chest. Calls, emails, and rushed meetings followed in rapid succession. The empire he had controlled so meticulously was now visibly fracturing, and he had no idea how or why. The reckoning had begun. He had underestimated me. He had humiliated me. And now, in the public eye, he faced the unraveling of everything he thought was untouchable. Thursday morning arrived with a quiet inevitability. Thomas had begun to realize that his empire, the one he had controlled with arrogance and absolute certainty, was now teetering publicly. Investor confidence had plummeted. Board members questioned him openly. Staff hesitated before executing any instruction. The cracks I had sown over weeks had widened into gaping fractures. And I watched it all unfold, unseen, untouchable, a silent force orchestrating the crescendo of his downfall. Every misstep, every hesitation, every panicked response was exactly as I had predicted. He thought he could outmaneuver the market, the board, the investors, but he never saw me coming. By mid-morning, I executed the final wave. A legally verifiable but strategically damaging report highlighting minor liquidity and contract concerns reached the largest investors and was quietly circulated to select media outlets. The board convened immediately. Thomas, exhausted, tense and flustered, faced relentless questioning. Every instruction he gave was challenged. Every explanation he attempted was met with skepticism. I allowed myself a quiet, controlled smile. The man who had laughed at my efforts, dismissed my insights, and belittled my presence was now cornered publicly. Every domino I had set in motion had aligned perfectly. By evening, the results were undeniable. Investor withdrawals were finalized. Media coverage hinted at instability without directly naming Thomas, but the implications were clear. Board members openly debated his ability to lead. Staff, sensing the tension, hesitated before executing any directive. Thomas, once untouchable, was now visibly panicked, scrambling to salvage what remained of his empire. The reckoning was complete. The empire he had built on arrogance, dismissal, and control was now crumbling in public view. By nightfall, Thomas's authority was shattered. Investors pulled funding, the board questioned leadership openly, and internal confidence was broken. Every misstep he had made under pressure compounded, creating a perfect storm of visible collapse. And I, unseen, calculated, meticulous, had engineered it all. The man who had humiliated me, dismissed me, underestimated me, was now forced to confront his failures under the scrutiny of the world. And I had done it without ever revealing my hand. I had won. Silently. Strategically. Irrevocably. The morning after the public collapse felt almost unreal. Thomas's empire, once untouchable, now stood fractured, teetering on the edge of financial and reputational ruin. Investors were cautious, staff whispered in corridors, and the board convened in crisis mode. From my apartment, I observed quietly, allowing myself a rare moment to breathe. It was the first morning I felt the tangible weight of my strategy fully realized. Weeks of invisible maneuvering, calculated pressure, and relentless precision had led to this. Thomas, who had once laughed at my contributions and dismissed my presence, was now facing the tangible consequences of his arrogance. And I had not lifted a single finger publicly. Not once. The first calls from investors and board members that morning confirmed the extent of the collapse. Withdrawals were being finalized. Public perception was shifting. Staff hesitated, unsure whom to trust. Every single piece of the empire I had touched was responding exactly as predicted. For a moment, I allowed myself a smile. Not out of cruelty, but because justice, executed with patience and precision, is profoundly satisfying. The man who had humiliated me, ignored me, and underestimated my influence was now confronting a reality he had never anticipated. By mid-morning, Thomas called emergency meetings in an attempt to regain control. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, now carried tension, hesitation, and faint desperation. Directors challenged him openly. Staff questioned priorities. Investors demanded immediate explanations. And still, I remained invisible, untouchable, the orchestrator of every ripple that had become a wave. Every misstep he made compounded the perception of instability. Every error, hesitation, or defensive statement reinforced the narrative of failure I had quietly constructed. By afternoon, the aftermath of my silent strike was clear. Thomas's credibility was shattered. The board openly questioned his leadership. Investors feared additional losses, staff were divided and uncertain. And in the quiet corners of the empire, my presence unseen but omnipresent dictated the next moves. I realized something profound: revenge, when executed with patience, precision, and invisibility, leaves no room for retaliation. The person who underestimated you cannot fight what they cannot see. And Thomas, for all his arrogance, had never seen me coming. By Tuesday, the empire Thomas had once commanded with effortless authority now moved in ways I controlled without ever appearing in the picture. Board members consulted with me indirectly through careful channels I had established. Investors, uncertain and wary, followed my subtle guidance. And Thomas was scrambling, attempting to repair what he could not fully see. The beauty of invisibility was that I could guide outcomes without confrontation. Every directive I issued, every influence I exerted, was precise, calculated, and untraceable. And every step Thomas took in desperation only reinforced the narrative I had meticulously built. He had no idea that I was the architect behind every move he thought was his own control. I began securing key alliances quietly. Trusted staff, previously loyal to Thomas, were subtly redirected to support strategic initiatives I oversaw anonymously. Investors who had wavered were reassured, guided to stabilize the board's confidence in the initiatives I championed. Contracts, acquisitions, and communications were now subtly influenced by my hand, ensuring that every action aligned with the trajectory I intended. The empire's gears were turning exactly as I wanted, even as Thomas continued to panic, trying to regain authority that had slipped from his grasp. Every attempt he made only deepened his isolation, while my influence expanded quietly and irreversibly. By mid-afternoon, the first visible acknowledgement of my influence emerged. Board members, unaware of my role, acted decisively in alignment with my guidance, stabilizing key operations without Thomas's direct input. Investors responded positively to the subtle reassurances I had orchestrated. Staff followed protocols I had quietly established. And Thomas, confronted by these outcomes, realized too late that control had shifted beyond his reach. He had underestimated me. He had dismissed me. He had thought my silence meant submission. And now, he faced the painful realization that he no longer held the reins. By evening, Thomas's position was irrevocably weakened. The board acted without him, decisions were made without his authority, and his influence over staff and investors had eroded completely. The man who once defined the empire's trajectory was now a bystander in the very organization he had built. The aftermath was clear. I had won, not with confrontation, not with aggression, but with strategy, patience, and invisibility. And Thomas, for all his power, could only watch the consequences unfold. By Wednesday, the consequences of my silent orchestration were becoming undeniable. Board meetings that once revolved around Thomas now shifted focus. Decisions, approvals, and strategic initiatives flowed smoothly, guided by my invisible hand. Directors, investors, and staff began instinctively following the systems and protocols I had subtly implemented, unaware that I was the one shaping every outcome. Thomas, once the unquestioned authority, could feel the shift. He walked into meetings with forced composure, but tension betrayed him. He tried to assert authority, to influence decisions, but his words were deflected, his instructions politely ignored. Every action he took seemed only to confirm the growing reality. He no longer controlled what he thought was his empire. And I watched it quiet and precise, savoring the moment justice had fully taken root. By mid-morning, the first subtle public acknowledgement of the shift occurred. Investors and senior board members began citing new initiatives and guidance that were yielding results. Praise, though never directly attributed to me, flowed into channels that Thomas could not influence. Staff followed protocols I had carefully woven into daily operations. The narrative had shifted entirely. The empire was moving efficiently without him, and he could not regain the perception of authority he had once commanded. The irony was exquisite. He had built this empire with arrogance and hubris, believing control was his by birthright. And now, The same empire operated more smoothly under invisible management, a testament to my strategy, patience, and intellect. By afternoon, Thomas's desperation became palpable. He attempted to publicly reclaim authority, issuing directives and proposing initiatives, but the board, confident in the stability and guidance already established, politely redirected the focus. Staff hesitated to act without board affirmation. Investors, reassured by the subtle shifts, continued their commitments, bypassing Thomas's input. For the first time, he realized the truth. The power he thought he possessed had quietly slipped away. The man who had laughed at my help, dismissed my insight, and belittled my presence now faced the irrevocable reality that he was no longer in control. By evening, the final pieces fell into place. Ellington Group was operating efficiently, investors were reassured, staff followed the silent guidance I had woven into every process, and Thomas, desperate, frustrated, powerless, could only witness the empire he had built moving smoothly without his input. The aftermath was clear. The reckoning was complete. Thomas had faced his public and private collapse, and I had secured full control, invisibly, flawlessly, without confrontation, without exposure. He had underestimated me, laughed at me, humiliated me. And now, he was powerless. Thursday evening arrived with a stillness that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the previous days. Thomas sat in his office, exhausted, tense, and visibly defeated. Investors had withdrawn. The board no longer deferred to him, and staff operated with precision under systems I had silently established. The empire he had once controlled through arrogance and dismissal now thrived without him. I allowed myself a rare, quiet smile. The silent victories, the invisible maneuvers, the patience and calculation, it had all led here. Justice had been executed without spectacle, without confrontation, yet it was undeniable. He had underestimated me. He had humiliated me. And he had learned, too late, that arrogance and control are fragile when challenged by intelligence, patience, and precision. By mid-evening, I reviewed the final outcomes. Investor confidence was restored under the systems I had placed. Staff productivity was higher than before the collapse. Contracts were secure. The board, still unaware of the invisible force guiding them, praised stability and clarity, and Thomas, he was left to confront the full magnitude of his defeat. It was a strange kind of satisfaction, not cruelty but validation. Not vengeance but justice. Every slight, every dismissal, every laugh he had directed at me had now been repaid by the outcome itself. By nightfall, Thomas faced the irreversible reality. The empire he had built with ego and power was functioning without him. Decisions, operations, and stability now moved under the silent orchestration of someone he had dismissed. The man who had once seemed untouchable now existed on the sidelines, powerless, watching the world he thought he commanded continue without him. And I, the one he had ridiculed, had guided it all. The lesson was clear. Patience, strategy, and intelligence can dismantle arrogance quietly, invisibly, and irreversibly. Power belongs not to the loudest, nor the most dismissive, but to those who act with foresight, precision, and calm determination. I had won not with confrontation, not with exposure, but with meticulous strategy. Thomas had lost everything, and in his absence of awareness, I had secured not just control, but a moral victory. The reckoning was complete, and the empire had a new direction, guided quietly, flawlessly, and forever changed. The weeks that followed Thomas's public collapse were quiet, almost surreal. Ellington Group, once a fortress of his ego, now moved efficiently and decisively under systems I had established. Staff adjusted seamlessly, investors regained confidence, and the board operated without hesitation. And Thomas was gone from the center of control, forced to witness the empire he had built thrive without him. I often thought about those first moments of dismissal, the subtle laughs, the belittling comments, the invisible walls he had tried to place between us. Every slight had fueled my resolve, every insult had sharpened my patience. And now, in the calm aftermath, I understood that true power often comes quietly, invisibly, and with precision. The man who had thought himself untouchable had never imagined that silence could be more powerful than confrontation. That strategy could outweigh arrogance. That patience could dismantle pride without spectacle. By mid-afternoon, I reviewed the full extent of the outcomes. Investor confidence was fully restored. Staff loyalty and productivity had strengthened. Contracts and acquisitions were secure. flowing through systems I had quietly guided. And Thomas. He had begun to accept his diminished role, forced to confront the reality that he no longer held control over the empire he had once ruled. It was a victory not born of vengeance, but of justice and strategy. I had proven that dismissal and humiliation are never harmless, they are invitations for quiet, meticulous retribution. The lessons he learned, painfully and publicly, were etched into every interaction, every decision, every ripple he could no longer influence. I reflected often on the journey, the moments of doubt, the silent calculations, the anticipation, and the ultimate satisfaction of seeing balance restored. Power is fleeting when wielded arrogantly. Influence is enduring when executed with patience, foresight, and precision. And in that knowledge, I found peace. The empire had survived, thrived even, without the man who had once defined it. And in that space, I realized something profound. Triumph is sweetest when it is measured not by spectacle but by invisible mastery, by foresight and by quiet justice. I had won. Thomas had lost. And the moral was clear. Arrogance underestimates patience. Dismissal underestimates intelligence. Humiliation underestimates resilience. True strength is unseen, calculated, and precise, and it always leaves a mark. Listen, if you've stayed with me this far, you know what it's like to be underestimated, ignored, or dismissed. Don't let your chance to be part of this story slip away. Subscribe now, don't just watch silently, because if you don't, someone else will get the advantage you're giving up. And if you don't hit that button, I want to hear in the comments why you let yourself miss it.